the controversy surrounding VVS Laxman, who is now livid with the conflict of interest allegations against him. Former India batsman VVS Laxman has lambasted the Committee of Administrators' handling of the Cricket Advisory Committee, alleging complete lack of coordination from the Vinod Rai panel. Now, to understand what VVS Laxman has said, what the entire issue of conflict of interest is, let me go across to my colleague Viren Farao, who will help us understand this. Over to you, Viren.
Thanks, Afrida. Now, let's remember, Afrida, that, this conflict of interest charge that's been leveled against three of the biggest legends of Indian cricket. And VVS Laxman is not known to be someone who usually gets angry very easily, but that was the case in his response to the BCCI, the BCCI's ombudsman. And he goes on to, in great detail, talk about how there's been a complete lack of communication. So what the Committee of Administrators, which includes Sachin Tendulkar, Sourav Ganguly and Laxman, actually did was they wrote to the BCCI at the end of last year, asking them what the role of this committee would be. They received no reply. Beyond that, then they were reached out to by the Committee of Administrators to try and appoint the women's team coach. Remember, after the controversy which surrounded the exit of the previous coach. Now, what has happened is that VVS Laxman says, how can I be accused of conflict of interest when we have no role, they get no money, there is no contract with the BCCI, and moreover, there are no terms of reference for this committee of the BCCI. Now, let's look at the three legends themselves and what it is that they, in terms of conflict of interest, are the allegations against them. As I said, they're three of the most famous Indian cricketers of this last generation: Sachin Tendulkar, Sourav Ganguly, and VVS Laxman. Let's begin by looking at Sachin Tendulkar, who wears two hats according to the conflict of interest complaint. One, as a mentor of the Mumbai Indians. Now remember, after winning the IPL title with the Mumbai Indians, where he was an icon player, Tendulkar went on to become a sort of mentor come icon come advisor. He's known to be close to the Ambani family. He's also part of that high-powered Committee of Cricket Advisory Committee, which is consists of all these players. Let's now look at Sourav Ganguly, who again, in this case, is accused of wearing three hats. Number one, mentor for the Sun. In fact, if we talk about Laxman, he's a mentor for the Sunrisers Hyderabad. Not only that, he's also the member of that Cricket Advisory Committee. Remember, Laxman, in his playing days, played for the Deccan Chargers, among other teams, and now going on to play a very important role, including selecting the team for the season. If we look at Sourav Ganguly now, he has a very interesting role as well. Ganguly, of course, advisor to the Delhi Capitals. He's been in the dugout. But what are the other hats that Ganguly wears? He was also the president of the Cricket Association of Bengal, a position which he was elected to. Again, it's honorary. No compensations actually paid to him. To understand the fallout of all these allegations and the responses of these cricketers, let's go to former India cricketer Atul Vasan, who joins us live on the show. Thanks, Atul, for speaking to us this morning. We don't see VVS Laxman usually very angry, but in this case, in the manner in which he's replied to the BCCI's ombudsman, one thing is clear: he's not very happy with the allegations. And secondly, he says, when I'm not being paid any money whatsoever, why is it that I'm being accused of this conflict?
It's early days. This is the transitional time. When the old ways the board used to run, when few people used to do everything and nobody used to question, is gone. And then people who have been growing up in that age probably feel that this is unfair. And at times, I think pushing the letter to the T is also. But having said that, too few cricketers were cornering all the things, and I think this will bring more democracy. More players will be involved in various ways. So I think they don't need to get angry. Just make sure that if the big players follow the system, then everything will fall in line. And I think they have made enough money in their life that a job here and there should not matter much.
Right, and Atul, I just want to go into some of what Laxman actually said. Now, in his response to the ombudsman, he says, when I wrote to the Committee of Administrators in December last year, now the Committee of Administrators, for all those watching, is the body that runs the BCCI appointed by the Supreme Court. He says in that reply, Atul, that when we asked them what our role was, what were our terms of reference, was this committee even in action as we, at that point in time, they didn't even bother to respond to him and tell him what the status was.
Yeah, there are other bigger issues, and I think it's such a confusion all around that we don't know what's happening and who's running the board. But having said that, I think you have to take it in a larger perspective. You can't be actually just chasing the players every time you receive a letter or an RTI or somebody complains about it. You have to have a kind of basic understanding, and I think everything should fall in line. It is not as bad as the olden days where only 5 or 7 cricketers were being selectors, were being mentors, were cornering everything. Now they know that they have to change their hats, that they have to hedge their bets in a particular field, and they can't do everything.
Right, Atul, stay with us because we've also got Saad bin Jung with us on the phone line. Saad, what do you make of the comments here from VVS Laxman? Because we've seen complaints go across to the BCCI's ombudsman. And let's also remind our viewers that aside from Saurav Ganguly, who now has a role with the Delhi Capitals, Sachin Tendulkar and VVS Laxman have been serving these roles for a number of years.
Well, I completely agree with what Laxman is saying because, and if you remember, Viren, you and I actually fought over this when the CAC itself was formed. The fact is that nobody knows what the role of the CAC is. It has to be clearly defined. And unless the role of the CAC is clearly defined, how will you define that it's in conflict? So actually what's happening right now to the BCCI itself is so frightening that it amazes me that the Supreme Court has not stepped in and clarified a couple of issues because none of the roles, they're not functioning to what they should be functioning for a 1,000 crore society. So I'm extremely saddened by what's happening because there's just so much of talent in India which is going to go to waste because of this. And Laxman certainly has a very clear point that he's making. Because if the CAC is only an advisory committee, which is what we said the first day that we heard about it many moons ago, then of course it should not have any relevance with selection. And if it is not involved in selection, and if it is not going to influence selection, then how can there ever be conflict? Because the advisory committee is advising the BCCI on cricket, and that's what it should be. And unless that role is clearly defined, there's going to be confusion. So I think, you have to certainly... The COA has to certainly move in, step in, and now tell the CAC that, listen, this is what you are, this is what we need out of you, and therefore, if you do these things, you will be in conflict, but you will only be in conflict if you're going to be affecting selection. And as they should never be, an advisory committee should never be affecting selection. I don't see where the conflict will ever come in.
Right, and Saad, one of the other things that Laxman points to is the fact that, there are no terms of reference. They don't know what their job is as on date. They're just basically operating whenever the committee of administrators suddenly seems to remember that there is such a body of Sachin Tendulkar, Ganguly and Laxman who they can call upon. It seems at no notice whatsoever.
Viren, this is again, there are two issues which need to be addressed over here. First is the issue of every player deciding for himself whether he's in conflict or not. And unfortunately, with the failures of the BCCI of such mammoth proportions, it's certainly the onus is on the player now, unfortunately, because the BCCI as a governing body is failing the system. So I think it's got to be every player who has to decide whether he's in conflict or not. But unfortunately, the money is so big that the morality and ethics sort of seems to take a big step back. Which is exactly the problem that we had with players when they were suddenly called professionals. From amateurs, they became professionals, and you hadn't defined the role of the professionals. So the player himself was extremely confused. So I think the whole setup that the BCCI has gone into, from amateur to professional, from every player now wanting to understand what his role is, especially with conflicts of interest coming in, the COA really needs to sit down very hard, have a think tank which thinks clearly, and come up with a policy not only for the administrators, but for the players also.
Right. Saad bin Jung and Atul Vasan, always a pleasure having both of you give us your views, and we've brought them for our viewers across the country. Watching all this play out, there are certain things that are yet to be clarified, and that's perhaps what Laxman seems to be hitting at, Afrida. This is not a controversy that's going to die down anytime soon. We've heard allegations in the past, but the problem is, will they be resolved for once and for all? Now is the question.
Right. Viren, thanks very much for joining us. And of course, like you said, the COA has a lot of thinking to do. It has to get its policy right on these contentious issues. Thanks very much for joining us.